Ladies and gentlemen, many believers spend their lives waiting for God to speak loudly, clearly, and unmistakably, expecting thunder, signs, or dramatic moments. Yet the truth is far more sobering. When God's message is most urgent, His voice often becomes quiet. This silence is not emptiness, nor is it distance. It is deliberate. It is sacred. It is a moment that demands attention rather than comfort. God's silence is not a pause in His care, but a deepening of His communication. It is in this quiet space that hearts are tested, motives are revealed, and faith is purified. With the passing of years, believers often assume they have already heard what they need to hear. Experience can create confidence, but it can also create spiritual dullness. God's silence gently confronts this assumption. It strips away the noise of routine prayers, repeated phrases, and familiar beliefs, calling the soul to listen without expectation and without demands. Silence requires patience, humility, and a willingness to admit that there is still more to learn. For those who have walked with God for many years, this silence becomes a mirror, reflecting not how long they have believed, but how deeply they are still listening. God's quietness should never be mistaken for approval or neglect. Silence is often the language of seriousness. Just as a loving presence grows still before delivering words of great importance, God's silence signals that something weighty is at hand. It invites reflection rather than reaction. It draws attention away from outward activity and toward inward truth. In this stillness, distractions lose their power, and the soul becomes aware of its true condition. What once felt like spiritual fullness may reveal hidden dryness. What seemed like faith may reveal habit. Silence exposes what noise often hides. For elderly believers, this sacred silence carries a unique weight. Time sharpens awareness, memories grow long, and life's fragility becomes undeniable. God's silence at this stage is not meant to frighten, but to focus. It calls the heart away from autopilot faith and into intentional devotion. It asks whether belief has remained alive or merely familiar. Silence invites an honest examination of whether trust has deepened or simply settled. It gently questions whether the heart still trembles at truth or has grown comfortable with it. Many grow uneasy in silence because it removes control. Words can be managed, silence cannot. In quietness, excuses fade, and the soul stands uncovered. God's silence creates space where repentance is not forced but invited, where humility rises naturally, and where surrender feels both costly and freeing. It is here that faith matures, not through excitement, but through attentiveness. Listening in silence requires courage, especially when it reveals areas long ignored. This silence is not punishment, it is mercy. God does not withdraw to abandon, He withdraws to draw closer. His quiet presence presses the heart to lean in rather than drift away. For those willing to remain still, to resist filling the silence with assumptions or distractions, something profound begins to happen. The soul becomes sensitive again. Truth is no longer rushed. Conviction is no longer resisted. Peace begins to form, not because everything is understood, but because trust has been restored. In this sacred silence, God is not absent. He is preparing. He is refining. He is warning gently before louder consequences are ever needed. Those who recognize this silence as an invitation rather than a void will discover that it carries wisdom deeper than words. Listening here is not passive, it is an act of faith. And for those willing to listen, the silence becomes the beginning of clarity, not the end of guidance. The passing of years is often viewed simply as time survived, but in God's design, years are entrusted, not merely endured. Each added season carries meaning, purpose, and responsibility. Long life is not given at random, it is measured, intentional, and observed by God. With every year lived, understanding deepens, experiences accumulate, and spiritual awareness is meant to mature. Yet this maturity is not automatic. Time alone does not produce wisdom. Response does. God's silent warning to elderly believers speaks directly to this truth, reminding the heart that longevity is not a spiritual conclusion, but an ongoing calling. As years increase, accountability quietly grows alongside them. Much has been seen, much has been heard, and much has been learned. God entrusts those who have walked longer with deeper discernment, not for personal pride, but for careful living. The warning is not harsh, it is solemn. It acknowledges that more has been received, and therefore more is expected. Familiarity with faith must not replace reverence. Experience must not dull sensitivity. The heart is reminded that knowing about God is never a substitute for continually walking humbly with Him. There is a subtle danger that comes with age, the temptation to believe that the most important spiritual decisions have already been made. This belief can quietly settle into the soul, creating comfort without vigilance. God's warning challenges this assumption. It reveals that spiritual growth does not retire. Obedience does not expire. The call to self-examination does not end with time. Each season brings its own responsibilities, and later years often carry the most delicate ones, guarding the heart, refining motives, and ensuring that faith remains sincere rather than symbolic. God's warning is not rooted in disappointment, but in trust. Trust that elderly believers are capable of depth, honesty, and courage. Trust that they can face truth without excuses. Trust that they can acknowledge areas where faith may have grown rigid instead of responsive. Years lived provide perspective, but they can also harden opinions if humility is neglected. God's warning gently presses against spiritual rigidity, reminding the heart that teachability is a lifelong posture, not a youthful phase. There is also a quiet responsibility tied to legacy. Even without words or actions, a life communicates. The way faith is carried in later years speaks loudly to others, whether intentionally or not. God's warning invites reflection on what kind of witness is being formed. Is faith marked by peace or by complaint, by gratitude or by fear, by surrender or by control? Accountability here is not about performance, but about alignment. The heart is invited to ensure that what has been believed is still being lived. Time has a way of revealing priorities. As physical strength changes and worldly ambitions fade, the soul becomes more exposed. God's warning meets believers in this space, urging them not to cling to what is familiar, but to what is eternal. It calls attention to subtle compromises that may have been justified over time. It asks whether obedience has been delayed under the assumption that there is always tomorrow. The warning is gentle but firm. Time is valuable and every remaining moment matters. This accountability is not meant to burden but to free. When the heart accepts responsibility without fear, clarity follows. God's warning is an invitation to realign, to simplify faith, and to release unnecessary weight. It reassures the soul that it is never too late to listen more closely, love more deeply, or surrender more fully. Accountability does not diminish dignity, it restores purpose. In these later years, God's warning carries compassion. It understands weakness, loss, and limitation, yet it also affirms that the soul remains active, responsive, and valuable. Faith is not measured by physical ability, but by attentiveness of heart. The warning reminds believers that God still sees, still calls, and still expects a living relationship. Years do not reduce spiritual significance, they increase it. Ultimately, the weight of years is not meant to press the soul into fear, but into reverence. God's silent warning to elderly believers honors the journey while calling for continued faithfulness. It speaks to the heart with respect, urgency, and love, reminding it that as long as life remains, so does purpose. Listening to this warning is not about regret over the past, but responsibility in the present. And for those who respond, the years ahead, however many, become marked not by decline, but by depth, clarity, and quiet strength. Many misunderstand God's warnings because they expect them to announce rewards, comfort, or reassurance. Yet this warning speaks in a different tone. It does not focus on what will be gained, but on what may quietly be lost if the heart remains inattentive. God is not warning about the absence of blessing, but about the slow erosion of sincerity. Over time, faith can become preserved rather than practiced, protected rather than pursued. This warning draws attention to that subtle shift, where belief remains intact in form but weakens in devotion. The concern is not outward behavior alone, but inward posture. It is possible to maintain correct beliefs while allowing the heart to drift into spiritual convenience. God's warning highlights unfinished obedience, areas where surrender was postponed, delayed, or negotiated. These are not always dramatic failures. More often, they are quiet hesitations, decisions deferred, convictions softened, truth acknowledged but not acted upon. Over the years, these small delays accumulate not loudly, but persistently, shaping a faith that looks steady yet lacks depth. This warning is also about quiet compromise, not the kind that shocks the conscience, but the kind that slowly dulls it. When obedience becomes selective and repentance becomes rare, the soul begins to settle. Comfort replaces conviction. Familiar prayers replace honest ones. God's warning interrupts this settling. It reminds the heart that faith was never meant to become static. Growth does not stop because time has passed. Sensitivity does not expire because much has already been endured. The warning calls attention to compromises that were once resisted but later tolerated. Another aspect of this warning concerns delayed surrender. There is a temptation to believe that full yielding can wait, that deeper obedience can be addressed later. But God's warning gently exposes the illusion of unlimited time. It does not threaten, but it clarifies. Spiritual delay carries consequences not because God is harsh, but because the heart gradually adapts to distance. What is postponed too long begins to feel unnecessary. The warning urges the soul to recognize that obedience loses its sharpness when continually deferred. This is not a warning about salvation being taken away, nor about God's love diminishing. It is about relationship losing its intimacy. When reflection fades, devotion becomes routine. When self-examination stops, growth slows. God's warning points to this danger, not to accuse, but to awaken. It asks whether faith has become more about memory than presence, more about tradition than transformation. These questions are uncomfortable, but they are merciful. God also warns about faith becoming habit instead of devotion. Habits can sustain structure, but they cannot replace living connection. Routine without reflection leads to spiritual numbness. The warning reveals that repetition alone does not preserve reverence. Without attentiveness, even sacred practices can become hollow. God's concern is not that faith exists, but that it remains alive. The warning calls the heart back from autopilot spirituality into conscious trust and intentional surrender. There is also a warning against spiritual pride disguised as experience. Long years of belief can create the assumption that correction is no longer needed. God's warning gently dismantles this idea. It reminds the heart that humility is not a beginner's lesson, but a lifelong necessity. Teachability is not weakness, it is faithfulness. When the heart stops listening, it stops growing. God's warning restores the posture of listening, regardless of how many years have passed. Importantly, this warning is not rooted in fear of endings, but awareness of closings. There are moments when spiritual sensitivity narrows if ignored too long. God warns before those moments arrive. He calls attention before distance becomes comfort, before silence becomes indifference. The warning is preventative, not punitive. It is meant to preserve what matters most while there is still space to respond freely. Ultimately, God is not warning about what He will withhold, but about what the heart might abandon without realizing it. Joy can fade without rebellion. Peace can weaken without crisis. Devotion can cool without denial. This warning brings these truths into the light. It invites honesty without shame and repentance without fear. It reassures the soul that awareness now prevents regret later. Those who understand this warning correctly will not respond with anxiety, but with clarity. They will recognize that God speaks because He cares and warns because He desires closeness. The warning is not the end of grace, it is evidence of it. And for those willing to listen, it becomes not a source of fear, but a doorway back into depth, sincerity, and renewed spiritual life. Listening has always been more than the ability to hear. It is the willingness to respond. God's final call in this silent warning is not directed at the ears, but at the heart. Many hear words, understand teachings, and recognize truth, yet remain unchanged. True listening requires humility, the kind that allows truth to interrupt comfort and reshape priorities. This call does not demand perfection, but attentiveness. It invites the heart to slow down, to stop assuming it already knows what God will say, and to become receptive again. At the center of this call is a single, searching question: is the heart still teachable? Time can either soften the soul or harden it. God's warning gently reveals whether faith has remained flexible or become fixed. A teachable heart is not one that doubts truth, but one that remains open to correction, growth, and deeper understanding. God's call is a reminder that learning does not end with age, and that humility is not diminished by experience. It is strengthened by it. Responding to this call requires more than agreement. It requires movement. Not outward activity, but inward alignment. God's warning asks for quiet honesty, an acknowledgement of where devotion has weakened or where trust has become conditional. This response is not about making grand promises, but about renewing small acts of surrender. Listening means allowing conviction to lead to change, even when change feels uncomfortable or overdue. This final call is serious, but it is not heavy. It carries urgency without panic and clarity without condemnation. God does not shout because He is not trying to frighten the heart into obedience. He speaks softly because He desires willing response. The seriousness lies not in threat, but in opportunity. There is a moment of invitation that does not remain open indefinitely. Listening now means stepping into peace later, not because everything has been resolved, but because alignment has been restored. God's call also invites a return to simplicity. Over time, faith can become complex, filled with explanations, justifications, and defenses. Listening strips faith back to its essence: trust, surrender, and love. The heart is reminded that it does not need to impress, perform, or prove anything. It needs only to respond. In this simplicity, the soul finds rest, not because responsibility has ended, but because resistance has. There is also comfort in this call. God would not warn if He had already withdrawn. The presence of warning itself is evidence of care. It reveals that God is still attentive, still engaged, and still inviting relationship. Listening to this call restores confidence, not in personal strength, but in God's patience. It reassures the heart that it has not been overlooked or dismissed because of time, weakness, or limitation. This final call asks for courage, the courage to be honest, to let go of familiar patterns, and to admit that growth is still possible and necessary. Courage is required to release the idea that faith has reached its final form. God's call affirms that transformation is not limited by age. As long as the heart can listen, it can change. As long as the soul can respond, it can deepen. Listening also reshapes the way the remaining years are viewed. Instead of being measured by loss or decline, they become marked by intention. Each moment becomes an opportunity to reflect trust, to practice gratitude, and to walk gently with God. The final call does not minimize weakness, it redefines strength. Strength becomes the willingness to depend fully on God without resistance or delay. Those who respond to this call find that peace does not come from certainty about the future, but from clarity in the present. Listening realigns the heart, quiets inner conflict, and restores purpose. There is no rush, no pressure, only a clear invitation to return fully and sincerely. In the end, God's silent warning reaches its fulfillment here. It was never meant to accuse or alarm, but to invite. Those who listen discover that the warning was an act of mercy offered in time. The heart that responds finds rest, not because the journey is complete, but because it is finally aligned. And in that alignment, the remaining path, however long or short, is walked with peace, assurance, and quiet confidence in God's enduring care.